taxing them basically, or we can raise external funds. Because charity is probably going to be insufficient, we're going to have to raise taxes. So both strategies are identical to coercive tax raising. Now, one form of this in practice shows up with public bads when we want to force people to consent to putting their property together. Amanda, what is that system called in practice when the government forces people to give up their land for a public project? You're not from the U.S., so it's a little bit unfair to you. It has a very specific name in the U.S. Someone who's from the U.S., does anyone know what it's called? Yeah, eminent domain. Got it, that's very cool. Yeah, so the government can force people to consent to a land assembly, and it's called the power of eminent domain. I actually think in Brazil the government doesn't have that power. That's one big problem in the favelas. But one way they can do it is they can raise funds from the beneficiaries, right, for public good. As Raj was saying, they can coerce people to contribute, right? Local communities often raise property taxes. Cities raise general revenue for many services. And this is true for much of non-national spending. In public bads, what that's called is eminent domain. So the government can force you to give up your property, and usually they're forced to pay you some sort of a quote-unquote just compensation. But these are usually based on the fair market value for land, rather than how much the individual person actually feels that their property is worth to them, given that it belonged to their family and so forth. And so this has caused a lot of social outrage, because people are pissed off about their land being taken and then the government giving them, whatever perfunctory amount. And in fact, this has been dramatically expanded by the Supreme Court in recent years, which has allowed it to be used not just for building a public road or something, but also for building a factory or building a commercial complex or a shopping mall or something like that. So this has been a big issue of public debate in recent years. Similar mechanisms exist for corporate debt or corporate acquisitions. So when a majority of people vote to accept an offer for a company being bought, it's not like the few remaining people can say, no, this is my share of the company, I don't want to give it up. They're forced to give it up if the majority votes for it. And that happens in some debt settlements. Some debt contracts have provisions where the government comes in and actually says, okay, because most people are willing to renegotiate this loan so that people don't get foreclosed on, we're going to force everyone else to accept that. And also you can collect some money coercively from outside to help ease the problem. So sometimes local cities get subsidies in making their schools better or something like that in order to try to solve part of this problem. Okay, so if we're going to use coercion from the government, we need to figure out whether it's worth using that coercion or not, right? Because that's not going to be determined by the market system and people freely interacting with one another. Some collective decision has to be made. This is called the problem of social choice. And it's very similar to the issues that we discussed with externalities. How do we figure out what the externalities are? And Alexandra, what were the ways that we talked about when we talked about assessing externalities that the government can try to figure out what the degree of externalities were? There were basically three ways we talked about.
Like in our conferences, we were talking about
In the class on assessing externalities, right? We talked about three ways the government can go about it.
just like getting an outside party, like an expert to look
Outside expert, that's right. Yeah.
or like trying.
So that's good. That's one. Does anyone remember the other two? Yeah, Mike?
You could have surveys which, like you said, would be very effective. People don't have
Yeah.
incentive to tell the truth, and also like the big part.
Yeah, that's right. So those were the two other main ones that we talked about. So assessment by experts, surveys, and the fancy Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism, right? And these three things are used with sort of declining frequency because, we have experts play a huge role in public policy, right? Surveys maybe play a little bit of a role, and I don't think anyone's ever used the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism to make a serious public decision. Jolene, what do you think might be some of the differences here versus the setting that we talked about when we talked about assessing externalities, which might change what we want to do?
People understand
Yeah, we said that sort of one aspect of public goods is that people's opinions are really important, right? That it's really important to get information from people, so we might not be so happy with just letting an expert decide on these things, right? So that's one important difference. Another thing is that a lot of these decisions are relatively simple. They're like binary things. They're not like how much of an externality it is or what's the right level of something, but just should we undertake some project, right? And there's also a very large number of individuals involved. So in many of these settings, we therefore want to get some input from people, but the fancy mechanisms and surveys don't work. So something that's often used is voting. And what do I mean by voting? Well, the simplest form of voting is everyone has, one man, one vote, and there's just a majority rule. But you could also have not just majority rule, you could say, well, 2/3 of the people need to agree, right? Or, 5/7 of the people need to agree, or something like that. And not everyone might have the same number of votes. So in a corporate acquisition, your voting is determined not by, one man, one vote, but rather by how many shares you own in the company, right? So this leaves us having to trade off or combine a range of different imperfect ways of making social decisions. So, Song Ping, what are some of the pros and cons of having an expert make a decision about these things that we talked about?
Well, if it's an expert, it's like an outsider, so he's got less of an incentive to make a decision either way.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also run into the problem that if he's an outsider, then would he really know what's going on?
Yeah, so those are two good downsides. What are the benefits of an expert?
Well, as an expert, he'll know more about the issue.
Yeah.
So he will give him a more well-rounded advice.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that.
And I also think that, the thing that he has less incentive is in some ways good because you don't run into all the incentive problems trying to get the things out of him. He may give a sort of dispassionate account of what the right answer is. Yeah, that's right. But on the other hand, he leaves out a lot of the important information that the individuals involved with. It's sort of undemocratic to have an expert decide. Mike, what do you think some of the ups and downs of the Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism?
So it tells exactly what the value is to people because of its
Yeah.
value. But it's really impractical to pull that off considering how much people can benefit from that.
Because,
It's they need to get the money, right? So there's
yeah, and there's the collusion problem, right? And the fact that all the money goes away and then you have to burn all the money, and that would be really problematic, right? So Vickery-Clark-Grove mechanism has these good sort of theoretical things, but in practice it doesn't seem to really make much sense, right? How about voting? Naveed? Naveed?
No?
Naveed? Yeah.
So the pros would be that it's really simple. If you set a majority rule
Yeah.
previously, you can easily see where the majority lies.
Yeah.
Some cons, maybe that you could have the, like, you know, tyranny of the majority if there's just enough people to, by some chance, if there's just enough people to get the vote passed, but
Yep.
there's still a very large part of society that's against it.
Yeah.
That could be, you know, ignoring the needs of the community.
Yeah, so I mean, the good thing is it provides a simple way to incorporate individual values, but it doesn't have that close of a connection to efficiency necessarily, right? A majority of people could be in favor, but that doesn't, but there could be a few people who are like incredibly against, and a bunch of people who are just weakly in favor, and there's no way to sort of take into account the fact that some people feel very strongly in one way or the other, right? So it's all based on the median of the distribution of people's values rather than on the mean, which is what really matters. So despite this, it seems like 2 is just like wildly impractical, right? And 1 and 3 both have benefits and costs relative to one another. So it seems like in practice we'd like to combine elements of 1 and 3. And Frushan, what system of government do you think would combine elements of 1 and 3?
Like, you know, like some sort of like a philosopher king or like a...
Well, that's sort of system 1.
Yeah,
System
and
1
like
is
a-
philosopher
and,
king.
like the philosopher king is sort of elected by a group of people, so it's like a combination of a republic and a philosopher king.
And so what practical system of government does that, do you think?
I guess like our system.
Yeah, pretty much. That's the whole idea behind representative democracy. We're supposed to elect the best people among us to. Now, does it ever always work out that way? Maybe not. But at least the philosophy behind the representative democracy is exactly combining systems of history. So we've sort of come up with an economic justification, at least in the abstract, for why you would want to have a representative democracy. So I've been doing some research recently on alternative systems that try to improve on some of these things, but I won't waste your time with that. So instead, I'll just finish by wrapping up the term. So this term, we tried to explore some of the, I think, most fundamental trade-offs that our society faces in determining how to organize its economy and society. And I hope that that gave you a better, more nuanced, and less ideological understanding of some of these fundamental trade-offs. So, you know, when you hear people in the media debating about capitalism and socialism and so forth, these are usually viewed as these two polar systems, and people are totally in favor of one and totally against one another, and they lump together a whole set of different institutions and trade-offs into like, I'm pro-market or I'm you know, pro-government or something like that. And I hope to have shown you that, in fact, the things which make up capitalism and the things which make up socialism are very complex, not necessarily all that related to one another, and that we can actually quantify the trade-offs between those different institutions, so that rather than just ideologically debating about one system versus the other, we can actually try to measure the costs and benefits of different parts of each system. So let me try to go through a few examples of what we did. So one trade-off is between, has to do with externalities and public goods. On the one hand, we know that if we don't internalize externalities, if we don't try to provide public goods, the theorems that we showed were that things can be very, very bad. There can be a lot of distortions from that. On the other hand, there's really no very good system for solving these problems. The best we can do is combine voting, which is very imperfect, with expert analysis, which is also very imperfect. So there's a trade-off between the costs of using the political system and the costs of ignoring the market failures, right? So that's one set of trade-offs that we face. A second one is the trade-off between redistributing income and providing social insurance on the one hand, and dampening people's incentives to work hard on the other hand, right? And that's